Smithsonian and the Giant Skeletons Conspiracy. For over a century, scattered reports have claimed that giant human skeletons, far taller than ordinary humans, were unearthed across America, only to vanish under the auspices of the Smithsonian Institution. According to this conspiracy theory, Smithsonian officials supposedly hid, suppressed, or even destroyed these bones to protect established narratives. This report examines the historical evidence behind such claims, identifies specific documented cases linking giant discoveries to the Smithsonian, explores who is alleged to be behind the cover-up and why, and reviews official responses and expert analyses on the matter. Numerous 19th and early 20th century newspaper articles reported the discovery of enormous human skeletons in North America. Many of these sensational stories explicitly mentioned the Smithsonian Institution, often implying that the bones were examined by, sent to, or coveted by Smithsonian scientists. Such references lent credibility to the accounts, even if the details were dubious. A few notable examples include 1897, Ohio. In Miamisburg, Ohio, a skeleton reportedly measuring over 8 feet tall was unearthed from a mound. Newspapers at the time claimed Smithsonian curator Professor Thomas Wilson examined the skull and affirmed the authenticity of the skull is beyond doubt, noting that similarly large monkey-like skulls had been found in Ohio's ancient mounds. This lent weight to the idea that a race of giants once existed. No confirmed Smithsonian records of this skull exist today. 1911, Arizona. Farmer Peter Marks discovered a prehistoric human giant skeleton on his ranch in Walnut Creek, Arizona. The find attracted so much attention that Mr. Shoup, an attaché of the Smithsonian, traveled to view it. Shoup took photographs and was keen to bring the skeleton back to Washington, D.C. for the Smithsonian's collection. Marks ultimately refused to relinquish it, but the incident shows Smithsonian personnel directly involved in investigating a purported giant. 1919, Texas. Newspapers announced a giant skeleton 18 feet tall had been unearthed near Seymour, Texas, a truly staggering claim. J.E. Pierce, a University of Texas anthropologist, remarked that if true, it would be the most important ethnological discovery ever made, dwarfing the tallest known human on record, around 8 feet 5 inches. The skeleton's discoverer, W.J. McKinney, reportedly planned to donate the bones to the Smithsonian, which had anthropologist Dr. J. Walter Fuchs conducting research in Texas at the time. No follow-up confirmation ever came, suggesting the claim did not pan out. Indeed, a fossilized 18-foot human would be utterly unprecedented. 1910, Idaho. An Idaho newspaper report described a giant skeleton found in a cave near Dixon, Idaho, in 1910, saying the bones were carefully packed and forwarded to the Smithsonian Institution for study. As with many such cases, once the remains left local hands for the Smithsonian, the trail went cold in the public eye, fueling later speculation that they were hidden away. Other reports. Dozens of similar stories appeared in the late 1800s to early 1900s. For example, an 1897 Minnesota newspaper article titled "Shrouded in Mystery" recounted how Smithsonian investigators excavating an Iowa mound found a skeleton 7 feet 6 inches tall, which crumbled to dust on exposure. In 1916, the New York Times ran a headline about horned giant skulls unearthed in Pennsylvania, allegedly with 7-foot skeletons, by reputable archaeologists. That sensational claim was later quietly corrected. The horns turned out to be deer antlers placed with the burials, not growths on human skulls. Many giants turned out to be misidentified megafauna bones, hoaxes, or simply tall but human skeletons embellished by storytellers. Archaeologists excavating a mound at Murray Farm in Pennsylvania, 1916, where newspapers claimed horned giant skeletons were found. The initial report of 7-foot horned men was later debunked. The apparent horns were deer antlers placed in the burial, not part of a human skeleton. These historical reports demonstrate a pattern. Extraordinary claims of giant skeletons grabbed headlines, often with a mention that the Smithsonian was involved or would receive the remains. In many rural communities, shipping an unusual skeleton off to the Smithsonian's museum seemed a logical next step, and newspapers eagerly reported it. This created the impression that the Smithsonian possessed a trove of enormous human bones. As we will see, that impression laid the groundwork for later accusations of a cover-up. Claims that the Smithsonian Institution deliberately suppressed evidence of giants date back to the early 20th century and have been revived in various forms up to the present. Proponents of this conspiracy theory argue that the Smithsonian and mainstream academia had strong motives to hide giants, such as protecting prevailing scientific or historical narratives. Some recurring allegations and suggested motives include contradicting accepted history. By the late 1800s, Smithsonian researchers like Cyrus Thomas and John W. Powell had decisively concluded that the Native American mound builders were not a separate lost race, but the ancestors of indigenous tribes. This debunked popular myths of an ancient super race of giants or outsiders building those earthworks. Conspiracists claim Smithsonian officials were too eager to dismiss any evidence, like giant skeletons, that didn't fit their narrative. In their view, Smithsonian archaeologists would destroy or hide giant bones to avoid resurrecting discredited ideas of a prehistoric giant race. Academic orthodoxy and evolution early 20th century anthropology leaned towards skepticism of anomalous finds. Alice Hrdlicka, the Smithsonian's physical anthropology curator, 1903 to 1943, was famously strict in his views of human evolution and the timeline of peopling the Americas. Fringe authors allege Hrdlicka enforced a policy of secrecy about giant skeletons. Field agents were discouraged from reporting unusually large bones. For instance, researchers Jason Jarrell and Sarah Farmer argue that an outsider who found giants in West Virginia in 1929 omitted the heights in his official report after he was made aware of the official Smithsonian policy of censorship regarding gigantic skeletons. They provide no internal Smithsonian documentation of such a policy, however, and Hrdlicka publicly stated there was no race of giants. He believed all giant claims resulted from mistakes. Protecting the chronology. A wildly popular internet hoax in 2014 claimed the Smithsonian admitted to destroying thousands of giant skeletons in the early 1900s to protect the mainstream chronology of human evolution. This fictional motive suggests that evidence of ancient giants would upend Darwinian evolution or the standard timeline of human history, so Smithsonian officials purged it. While this scenario originated in satire, it echoes real suspicions held by some creationist and alternative historians, namely, that proof of giants, perhaps even biblically linked giants like the Nephilim, would bolster religious or alternative worldviews at odds with mainstream science, and thus was covered up by a science establishment. Sheer narrative control. The Smithsonian, as the nation's premier museum and research complex, is sometimes cast as a near-omniscient gatekeeper of historical truth. Conspiracy proponents often implicate unnamed Smithsonian higher-ups or influential scientists in a broad effort to control the historical narrative. In these theories, figures like John Wesley Powell, director of the Bureau of Ethnology, and Alice Hrdlicka appear as key players who decided that giants didn't fit the story of America's past and saw to it that any inconvenient specimens disappeared. One author, Richard J. Dewhurst, goes so far as to claim that an advanced race of giants once ruled America, and the Smithsonian has been actively suppressing the physical evidence for nearly 150 years. Such claims usually cite the many newspaper reports of giant skeletons, as cataloged above, and then point to the absence of those skeletons today as proof of deliberate suppression. It's important to note that the Smithsonian did accumulate an enormous collection of human remains from across the U.S. during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Smithsonian archaeologists conducting mound excavations solicited local collectors to send in bones and artifacts. By one estimate, the institution gathered over 18,000 skeletons, mostly Native American, for its anthropology collections. Even today, the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History holds approximately 30,700 sets of human remains in storage. Conspiracy theorists often point to these vast, non-public collections as suspicious. Perhaps hidden among them are the remnants of giants. However, no giant skeleton has ever been documented in the Smithsonian's inventory. In fact, many of those remains have been studied, inventoried, or repatriated to tribes under NAGPRA, with no 8-foot-tall anomalies reported. The Smithsonian Institution has consistently denied any wrongdoing or secret policy regarding giant human remains. Whenever the giant cover-up claim flares up in public discourse, Smithsonian representatives and mainstream scholars have responded with firm rebuttals. In 2014 and 2015, after a satirical article falsely claiming the Smithsonian confessed to destroying giants went viral on social media, fact-checkers reached out for comment. Smithsonian spokesperson Linda St. Thomas stated the claim was baseless. No truth to it at all. The purported Supreme Court case ordering the Smithsonian to release classified documents never occurred. In reality, the story originated on a fake news website known for fabrications. The Smithsonian pointed out that myths about giant skeletons have circulated for decades and decades, often propelled by doctored images from Photoshop contests and viral internet memes. In short, the official stance is that no giant skeletons were ever secretly in the Smithsonian's possession, much less destroyed. Going back to the 1930s, Smithsonian anthropologists themselves addressed the issue. Alois Hrdlicka, as head of physical anthropology, investigated numerous giant claims. In a 1934 scientific publication, he flatly rejected the existence of a race of giants around 7 to 8 feet tall. Hrdlicka attributed the persistent giant reports to the will to believe and the mistakes of amateur diggers. He noted that often a large femur, or thigh bone, was mismeasured and extrapolated to human height by people unfamiliar with anatomy, yielding an exaggerated stature. Many finds were actually Ice Age animal bones mistaken for human. Far from admitting any cover-up, Hrdlicka's stance was that there were no giants to hide. The claims themselves were unreliable. The institution also emphasizes that every significant anthropological find in its collection is catalogued. If a spectacular 9 or 12-foot skeleton had ever been received, it would have been studied and displayed, as it would be a monumental discovery. Smithsonian museums have indeed showcased the verified remains of unusually tall humans. For example, skeletons of individuals around 7 feet tall, or the cast of Robert Wadlow, who was 8 feet 11 inches, the tallest man in recorded history. But these are within known human variation. No unknown giant humanoid species has ever been presented. The absence of any such specimens on record aligns with the consensus that none were legitimately found, rather than indicating a hidden warehouse of bones. Mainstream archaeologists and historians who have studied this topic overwhelmingly find no credible support for the notion of a Smithsonian cover-up. Key points from expert analysis include: many giants were misreported. Modern researchers have combed through the old newspaper archives to fact-check the giant skeleton accounts. Archaeologist Donald J. Ball collected reports dating back to the 1840s and found that upon closer scrutiny, none held up. In case after case, either the measurements were later corrected or no tangible remains survived for verification. For example, an 1883 Indiana news story of a 9-foot skeleton prompted an investigation by a local doctor. He determined the skeleton was barely 5 feet 8 inches tall and labeled the affair a giant fraud on the public. Such debunkings rarely got the same wide coverage as the initial sensational claims, so the legend of giants grew even as investigations refuted them. American history is rife with archaeological hoaxes, the most famous being the Cardiff Giant of 1869, a carved stone figure falsely passed off as a petrified man. P.T. Barnum and others exhibited fake giants to thrill audiences. The San Diego Giant of 1895, a supposed mummified 8'4" giant, was purchased by Smithsonian scientists who quickly discovered it was fabricated from gelatin. They exposed it as a hoax, not a genuine fossil human. Many photographs circulating online of excavated giant skeletons are outright digital manipulations created for entertainment. Scholars note that belief in giants often made people gullible to tricks, a dynamic exploited by showmen and pranksters. The prevalence of frauds and tall tales explains why no confirmed giant bones ever made it into scientific collections. Importantly, historians find no evidence in Smithsonian's own records of any deliberate destruction or concealment of anthropological finds. The institution's annual reports and correspondence in the 19th and 20th centuries extensively document excavations, acquisitions, and even controversies. For example, the Smithsonian has openly discussed cases where claimed ancient finds turned out to be recent or fraudulent. Nowhere is there a hint of a directive to hide skeletons. If anything, Smithsonian personnel often sought sensational finds, as seen with Mr. Shoup's attempt to acquire the Arizona giant in 1911, or the interest in the Texas fossil giant in 1919. The lack of any giant in the museum's collection is best explained by lack of genuine evidence, not a successful cover-up. Physical anthropologists confirm that human skeletons in the Americas and elsewhere can occasionally belong to very tall individuals. For instance, a height of 7 to 8 feet due to genetic gigantism or simply exceptional stature. However, no population of giants has ever been found. If an entire race of double-height humans had existed, we would find multiple such burials and clear skeletal differences, which we do not. The tallest skeletons reliably recorded from ancient North America, often from burial mounds, are around 7 feet tall, but within normal human variation. These have not been suppressed. Some are noted in archaeological literature. Claims of 10, 12, or 18-foot humans lack biological plausibility. The human frame struggles to support such size, and are typically dismissed by scientists as folklore or error. Historian Adrian Mayer points out that many giant legends likely stemmed from ancient people finding megafauna fossils, like mammoth or mastodon bones, and imagining they were human. Early settlers and even presidents, Thomas Jefferson among them, sometimes misinterpreted big bones as giant humans until corrected. In summary, archaeologists and historians overwhelmingly regard the giant skeleton cover-up as a myth. They find that purported evidence for giants dissolves under scrutiny, and there is ample documentation explaining the fate of these finds. Hoaxes exposed, mistakes corrected, fragile bones disintegrating without invoking conspiracy. The burden of proof lies on those claiming a cover-up, and so far, no verifiable giant skeleton or smoking gun document has ever been produced. Despite the enduring allure of giants in folklore and fringe theory, the most credible evidence indicates that the Smithsonian Institution has not hidden or destroyed giant human skeletons. The historical cases cited as evidence of giants are, upon close examination, either exaggerations, misunderstandings, or outright hoaxes, not bona fide discoveries that needed suppression. Yes, Smithsonian researchers were involved in investigating many reported finds, often debunking them, and the institution did collect thousands of skeletons from archaeological sites. But not a single verified giant skeleton exists in Smithsonian archives or any other museum. None is documented in scientific records that would support the sensational claims. The conspiracy theory positing a deliberate cover-up tends to rely on gaps in the historical record. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian and then we never heard more, and an assumption of nefarious intent. Modern proponents have spun elaborate narratives that unnamed Smithsonian officials, or specific figures like Hrdlicka, conspired to erase giants from history to uphold academic consensus or ideological goals. However, no primary source has surfaced, no leaked letter, no hidden inventory, to substantiate that the Smithsonian secretly destroyed evidence. On the contrary, Smithsonian officials have publicly refuted the allegations, and independent experts find mundane explanations for the disappearance of those oversized skeletons. When followed up, they simply did not hold up as giant after all. In light of the available evidence, including primary newspaper reports and Smithsonian records, there is no credible support for a giant skeleton cover-up. What remains are fascinating anecdotes from America's past tall tales of giants that speak to our love of the sensational. The motives often cited for hiding giants, protecting scientific reputations, or controlling the narrative, are speculative and unnecessary, since mainstream science was never truly confronted with an actual giant skeleton to explain away. As the Associated Press succinctly concluded, the claims that the Smithsonian admitted to destroying thousands of giant bones are false. In the end, the Smithsonian giant's legend appears to be just that, a legend, lacking the hard evidence that would be expected if an enormous cover-up had taken place.